And you feel like saying, well, unless people do start putting their head above the parapet and agreeing with it publicly, then we're never going to push back against this stuff.
Hello and welcome to the Ideas Sleep Furiously podcast. I'm Matt Archer. Today I'm speaking with one of my favourite political writers at the moment, Mr. Paul Embery. Paul is a firefighter and a trade union activist by day, so he's only a writer by night. And he's just published his first book. It's called Despised, Why the Modern Left Loathes the Working Class, a title which very much tells you what the book is all about. So we talk about that, we talk about Paul's upbringing, and we talk about his place really within what's been called the Blue Labour movement, this loose affiliation of thinkers like Matt Goodwin and David Goodhart, who has also been on the podcast, which presses Labour to be, yes, radically left-wing on the economy, but also socially conservative when it comes to these cultural issues that are very much important to the former Labour heartlands, which Boris Johnson won in the last election. So we talk about Paul's thoughts on how Labour can win back those seats and whether Labour actually can ever win a general election again if they don't do that. I'm also joined by my friend, Rory James. He's a political analyst and a writer himself. Rory has an affinity for George Orwell, as you can see by the poster behind him in the interview, and that's exactly what Rory wanted to ask Paul about. He sees a comparison between Paul and Orwell, and so he wanted to probe Paul on the comparisons. So without further ado, I give you a very interesting conversation with one of the most exciting writers out there at the moment, Mr. Paul Embery. Okay, Paul, thank you for joining us.
Pleasure.
So the first question I'd like to ask you, because we've got a lot of American viewers and listeners, is to just get you to give a brief overview of your background and actually how you came to write Despised.
Well, I grew up in a borough in East London, Barking and Dagenham, which was a very working class, what you might call blue collar area. It always traditionally voted in large numbers for the Labour Party. And it was a very kind of stable area, a typical working class community, a very sort of deep sense of belonging amongst the community, a sense of unity, a common culture in many respects. I mean, I don't want to romanticize it. The place has its problems in the way that all areas do, and many working class areas do. But they were generally high levels of employment. There was the famous Ford plant on the doorstep, the subject of the film Made in Dagenham, of course. And as I say, it was always very much the type of area that looked to the Labour Party and the wider Labour movement to advance its interests. And during, I would say, the first decade of this century, there was a very profound and significant shift in the borough in all sorts of ways. And this was, I think, the decade where working class communities such as Barking and Dagenham started to really feel the effects of the new global market. And this manifested itself in a couple of ways. Firstly, in large-scale deindustrialization. So we saw the loss of industries and factories. The Ford plant shipped production abroad, and thousands of blue-collar jobs were lost. And we also saw rapid demographic change as a result of things like EU free movement. So you had, on the one hand, very significant economic change through deindustrialization, but also very significant social and cultural change as a result of a kind of open borders policy, really. And that created a very real sense of bewilderment and disorientation within the local community. That bewilderment and disorientation was dismissed by large parts of the political class, notably the left, as racism and bigotry and xenophobia. And in fact, it was anything but. It was just people who felt that their sense of place was being violated, their sense of belonging was being violated, not their sense of race. So it struck me, and I was probably in my sort of mid-20s around about that time, it struck me that a very serious disconnect was emerging between the left and the working class, because it was quite clear that this kind of phenomenon was happening in other working class communities up and down the country as well. And I was pretty rooted in the Labour movement. I've been a trade unionist since I was 16. I'd been a member of the Labour Party since about 1994. So it concerned me actually that this very obvious chasm was emerging. And I spent some years warning my colleagues in the Labour movement about what was going on in communities like mine. But they didn't listen, and they said, well, you know, you're pandering to racism and bigotry. You've got a romantic idea of the old working class. Most working class people are in favour of this new sort of liberal cosmopolitanism and this sort of open borders economically and culturally. And for me, the writing was on the wall, and I predicted the rupture between the Labour movement and the working class some years before it happened. So I wasn't surprised when it happened. So someone asked me to write a book about it because I think they felt that I had something valuable to say on it. So that's what I did.
Have you always written?
I have always written, but I've not always been read. I always had a love of writing, actually, even when, I mean, I went to the sort of bog standard comprehensive school. I went out to work at 16, didn't actually set foot in a university until I was in my 30s, and that was to take my son to a karate grading at the sports hall in a university. But I always loved writing. I always had a passion for it. But it was only really, I guess, in the last few years that some people decided that they would give me a platform on which to write. So the digital magazine UnHerd came along and asked me to write a regular column, which I was more than happy to do, and then the book as well, of course. So I sort of grabbed that opportunity.
Did you write a diary? Did you write for smaller outlets?
I had a bash actually at writing a diary when I was about 13 years old. I wrote a diary for about half a year. God knows what happened to it. It was probably just mainly filled with entries playing football at the time, I would imagine, which I was pretty obsessed with doing. Although I must say I do keep a diary now, mainly because I've got a couple of kids, and I think it's quite a nice thing to do, you know, when the kids grow up. But it doesn't contain any sort of unique personal or political insights. I mean, it's not going to be serialized like Tony Benn's diaries in years to come. It's just a personal thing. I think the first thing I probably wrote that was published, I think, was probably something for the New Statesman, the website, the New Statesman, Staggers Online, I think it was. And that was because I'm a firefighter by trade, and that's still my primary job, although not everybody realises that. And I was an activist and an official in the Fire Brigades Union, the FBU, for many years. And about 10 years ago, we were having a campaign to save some fire stations in London when Boris Johnson was the mayor and was trying to, and eventually did close a number of fire stations. And I wrote about it for the New Statesman. And then I did a few pieces for the Huffington Post. And then particularly around the time of the EU referendum in 2016, when I was one of the sort of small number of people on the left who were pro-Brexit, some people came along and you know, asked me to write and do a bit of media work then, and things have really kind of escalated from there. Yeah.
I was going to say, you know, as putting yourself out there as a public figure, you know, someone who's quite active on Twitter, have you had to grow a thicker skin? Has being a public figure changed you, or have you already had that skin developed from when you were working for the Fire Brigades Union?
I have to say, I think, I mean, you could call it a thick skin, but I've never had a problem at all with people criticising me, taking a different view. The abuse, which comes quite regularly, I can't say it particularly bothers me. I mean, I don't think it should happen when it's just gratuitous abuse, but I can't say I've ever lost a moment's sleep over it. I mean, I never. Some people call me a contrarian. And you know, when people say to you, "Are you a contrarian?" when you think about it, it's impossible to answer that question without proving the point, isn't it? So, but I mean, I'm not. I genuinely don't argue things that I don't believe in. I only ever argue things that I genuinely believe. I wouldn't take a view just for the sake of taking the view and, you know, stimulating debate. You know, I do mean what I say. But I've always had, I think, a tendency to look for the alternative view rather than just follow the mainstream view. And if the alternative view held water and was worth arguing and had merit, then I'd be quite happy to take that view. And I never had a problem with being in a minority of one. Even in arguments in the school playground, if everyone was arguing one way, I think I would consciously look to see if there was an alternative argument that I felt was valid. And if there was, I'd pick up on that argument and press it, even if I was the only person doing it. So I've never had a problem with being in a minority. I've never had a problem with putting myself out there and putting my head above the parapet. And if that means that people throw brickbats at you and abuse at you, then so be it. You have to have. Dennis Healy famously said, everyone has to have a hinterland in politics. And I've got that. I've got a great family. I've got other interests. So whatever happens in the political campaigning activist world, that's often secondary to what goes on in your personal life, to be honest, I think.
Do you find it easy to say, I don't know, or I was wrong?
I have said I was wrong, and I think it's important that people do that rather than just hold the line for the sake of saving face. And I think actually in doing that, you probably earn more respect from people, because you find yourself people see you, I think, to be more open-minded. I mean, when I was in my late teens, early mid-20s, I was like most other activists on the left. I mean, I sort of flirted with the far left, the Socialist Workers' Party, flirted with Marxism. I was very comfortable with the whole concept of cosmopolitan liberalism. In the early years of, as I said, this decade, the first decade of this century, when the area I was living in, Barking and Dagenham, was going through those profound changes. At first, I was quite relaxed about the whole thing and would probably, would lecture people, neighbours and friends about how all of these very quick and far-reaching changes in our community were actually good for us. Probably give us a couple of extra percentage points on GDP, and culturally enriching, and all of this kind of stuff. And actually, when you go through a phenomenon, an experience like that, where your community really is in the eye of the storm of the national debate around that stuff, because don't forget, in 2006, in the borough of Barking and Dagenham, the BNP won 12 seats on the local council. It was their best ever performance in local government, and they actually formed the official opposition on the council. So when you go through that and you actually take the time to listen to people rather than lecture them and just patronise them with slogans, and to hear exactly what their issues are and what their concerns are, you can't fail to have your mind changed by it, which pretty much happened to me. I came out of that process and thought, actually, just going to these people and dismissing them as racist and bigoted and preaching to them the precepts of cosmopolitan liberalism and open borders doesn't work, because it doesn't actually address what their problems are. They were, by and large, tolerant people, open-minded people, but they had, like most working class communities, a real sense of rootedness and belonging, which, when that is violated so quickly, just makes them feel uneasy and uncomfortable. The whole sense of what they were familiar with and what they'd been used to around them for many years was just changing very, very rapidly and very significantly, and in all sorts of ways, as I said, economically, culturally, socially. And just saying to people, well, this is good for us, really doesn't cut it. And I realised that when at the end of that decade, you saw what had happened to the borough, where the BNP had moved in and had suddenly become quite a significant force. Thousands of families had simply moved away from the borough. There was a mass exodus of families who had been rooted in the borough for generations. So that was probably the best example of where I significantly changed my mind and had to say to people, look, I was very profoundly wrong on this, and because I was wrong, I in many respects, personally, on a very small scale, would have driven people away from the Labour movement, because I was a Labour movement activist, I was a trade unionist, I was a Labour Party member, and people were recoiling at my arguments, and I could see it. And if that was happening to me locally, it was very clearly happening to the Labour Party and the Labour movement on a national level as well.
I am probably not the first person to point this out, but there are many, many similarities between you and George Orwell. And Rory is a big fan of Mr. Orwell. And I know, Rory, you wanted to ask Paul a very specific but interesting question.
Yeah, so we've got him looming over my shoulder here. It's a bit blind for Orwell. So, Paul, in one of the most quoted lines from 1984, George Orwell wrote that in a time of universal deceit, telling the truth becomes a revolutionary act. Orwell was writing at a time when much of the Western left was in the thrall of the great Soviet experiment with communism, something which he was almost instantly repelled by on a point of principle, seeing the relativization of truth and unsentimental brutality of communism firsthand in the Spanish Civil War. Having been suppressed and slandered throughout his public life by fellow leftists that were pro-Stalin, it wasn't really until after his death that Orwell was vindicated in his anti-communist views, as the horrors of the Soviet Union were exposed by the likes of Alexander Solzhenitsyn and the logs were taken from Western intellectuals' eyes. In 2021, the modern left seems to be once again willing to trade democratic principles and objective truth in favour of ideological purity, from the campaign to overturn Brexit, the Brexit referendum on one hand, to the ever more hysterical pitch of the debate surrounding issues of personal identity on the other. So in this sense, Paul, do you feel like you're following in the tradition of independent thinkers on the left like Orwell, as an unorthodox voice within a modern left that's become obsessed with a new grand social experiment imported from abroad, in this case, American-style identity politics? And why do you think it is that the left has this tendency to err on the side of authoritarianism in its desire to deliver grand utopian visions?
Well, it's flattering to be mentioned in the same breath as Orwell. I mean, he was obviously a giant, and I would love to think that, you know, I and others are following in that tradition. I think it's a very, very important question you ask, because I think in many respects it's ironic. You have large sections of the left today who constantly bang on about the importance of, you know, holding mainstream media to account, and mainstream media should always report the truth and should always report the facts, no matter how inconvenient. And, you know, they go for people like Laura Kuenssberg, the BBC political editor, and others when they don't report what they consider to be the facts, and, you know, have too cozy a relationship with Boris Johnson, allegedly. And yet when it comes to other subjects, the left is quite happy, large parts of the left at least are quite happy to see truth relegated to behind the importance of people's feelings, and, you know, the importance of the cosmetic argument rather than the actual factual argument. So that's a fascinating thing in many ways. And there's no question, yes, that there's large parts of the left today who have taken on that authoritarian tradition, that sort of Stalinist tradition. We are on the left living in a kind of new age, really, of a kind of Stalinism, where anybody who doesn't conform to the left's kind of agenda of hyper-liberalism and to the particular opinions that are promoted by large parts of the left are not only marginalized in a political sense, but are actually told you mustn't say that, and are actually told if you do say that, then you have no place on the left. And there's a huge number of examples. I mean, even things like, you know, we've already touched on. I mean, things like free movement of workers. Now, once upon a time, the whole concept of open borders was actually a fringe position on the left. It was a concept that was argued really only by hyper-liberals and anarchists and Trotskyists, and the vast majority of the left, until fairly recently, believed in regulation of the labour supply. You know, old-fashioned socialists and trade unionists knew that a government, particularly a government of the left, should have the power to control the labour supply, so as to give that government the best opportunity to improve conditions for workers, to plan around employment, housing, welfare, and so on. If you argue that position now on the left, regulation of the labour supply, as I do, you're told that you don't belong on the left. You're told actually you're some sort of reactionary or nativist or bigot, and people will no platform you because of it, because, you know, they don't like your view and don't think it belongs on the left. So that's an example actually of how things have shifted so dramatically. And there are other things as well where there's an element of groupthink, where one particular orthodox view is the accepted view, the conventional wisdom, and no other view is allowed space. I mean, the other example, I suppose the other obvious example, is the whole question of gender. which the left now seems absolutely obsessed with, in a way that I think leaves most ordinary people in this country completely scratching their head. But because the left is so obsessed with it, it's almost impossible to be on the left and not get involved in the debate somehow. But simply to say, and we've seen examples, the recent example of Kathleen Stock and others, simply to say, look, of course we accept that people should be free to live their lives within the law as much as possible. We believe that sex is immutable. We believe in the right of women to defend their sex-based rights, etc. Just invites a whole load of scorn and abuse on the left, to the degree, again, that people say that you have no position on the left. And it's this thing, I think, that has developed in British politics, particularly on the left, where almost to cause offence, almost to take an alternative view, is to cause offence in itself. So people will say to you, that's offensive. You've advanced an offensive view, as if that's the clincher in the debate, and the debate should go no further. If someone is offended, then that itself is an offence, regardless of the merits of what you're saying and arguing. Simply to call someone offence is almost a sin. And people on the left are increasingly saying, you mustn't say that, rather than, as they used to say, I disagree with you, and here's the reason why. And it's the old thing, they want diversity in everything apart from thought, which is the main thing we should have diversity in. And that attitude has led to safe spaces in universities and as I said, groupthink on an unimaginable scale. And I think I have to say, and this probably goes back to Orwell, I think, was hugely courageous in writing and arguing the stuff that he did. But it strikes me that on the left today, and in fact in public life generally, there's a huge amount of cowardice. I mean, I have people come up to me and say, including activists on the left, who say, of course some of the stuff you're saying is absolutely right, but I have to be careful about agreeing with it publicly. And you feel like saying, well, unless people do start putting their head above the parapet and agreeing with it publicly, then we're never going to push back against this stuff. And there are people in public life, people in our public institutions, our public services, in trade unions, in parliament, who themselves know that a lot of what is going on is unacceptable, but are not prepared to put their head above the parapet because of the impact on their career, etc. And we need to frankly put pressure on people to start doing so. Otherwise, this sort of atmosphere won't change. And my friend Maurice Glasman, the founder of Blue Labour, says quite rightly, there's none so intolerant as those who preach tolerance. And it seems to me that that's exactly right. And we need to push back against those people.
Yeah, it's even crazier, isn't it, when you realise that it's maybe 5% of people who are the radical pink-haired warriors on Twitter, and then you've got that 20% who just will go along with it because anything but the Tories, anything but Trump. And that's really I think you never, like John Walter says, you've got to realise it's a religion. There's no point talking to these people. Okay, there's no point arguing with them. But that 20% who will just go along with it unthinkingly, they probably are worth talking to, right?
Yeah, I think there's an element of people who can be one, but there's a large body of people who are simply so dogmatic about it that they see it almost as a battle between good and evil. They assume that their own views are inherently right, inherently correct, and that they are filled with some sort of moral rectitude, and that anybody who doesn't subscribe to that particular viewpoint must by definition be something less of a human being. And that attitude is very prevalent on the left. I see it, and I said earlier about the importance of changing your mind. I mean, I have to say I've been susceptible to that attitude myself in the past. When you're a headstrong activist on the left and you're surrounded by people who think exactly as you do, it becomes mutually reinforcing. And the people over there on the other side of politics are regarded not just as opponents, but as enemies, as personal enemies, as something less than humanity almost. And that leads
Tory scum, right?
Well, exactly, and that leads you, I think, potentially into all sorts of dark places when you are so filled with your own righteousness and a belief that you must be correct on all of this stuff. There almost becomes no limit to what you would happily see done to your enemies. And that is still a very prevalent attitude on the left, and it's a dangerous one.
Yeah, I just find it unbelievable that people even have to preface the reaction to the brutal murder of Sir David Amess, my MP actually, with anything about his political views. Like your article for UnHerd obviously talked about that, but that is, I guess, what you're talking about there. The darkest place it can go to is when people feel like they have to even mention it. It's bizarre. I don't know if you want to comment on that, because it is a very important story.
Yeah, I mean, I saw lots of similar, to you. I saw lots of statements about it, heavily qualified with, we may not agree with his views,
Yeah.
and whatever his views, this shouldn't have happened. And I don't quite remember the same qualifications being attached to the terrible murder of Joe Cox. And I think that does speak to the inherent belief among large parts of the left that these people are actually so terrible that even in death we have to make it very clear that we don't agree with any of their views. And I just think, really, as I said in that piece, I think the whole thing is a bit of a caricature. Look, I mean, I've never been a Tory, and I cannot ever imagine voting Tory. For me, the Labour movement has always been the vehicle by which the working class has advanced its interests economically in other ways. You look at the National Health Service, the welfare state, trade union rights, the minimum wage, all of this sort of stuff. The willingness, at most points in its history, although perhaps not more recently, to challenge market orthodoxy and the dominance of the market. And so that leads me to be on the left, and that leads me to be part of the Labour Party and the wider Labour movement. But it's quite clear to me that most people on the other side of politics are not inherently evil. I mean, there's this caricature of people in the Conservative Party, or even people who are small c conservatives and not even necessarily supporters of the Conservative Party, but people on that side of politics all being pinstripe suited, bowler hatted city gents who are out to screw everybody and they're only in it for themselves. Actually, I mean, I live in an area now which is what you might call a true blue Tory area. I mean, there's no chance of a Labour MP being elected around here. But in the community where I live, I dare say most people vote Conservative. In fact, I'm pretty sure they do. But actually, most of them are pretty fundamentally decent people. They look out for each other. They work for charities. During the recent pandemic, they were calling on their neighbours. I'm quite sure that if I fell down in the street outside their house and they know me as a Labour movement activist, they wouldn't leave me lying there. They'd probably pull me in and help me to recover and whatever. So I mean, I'm a great believer. And Tony Benn, one of my political heroes, always said, it's about issues, not personalities in politics. If you just want to have a debate the whole time about personalities and about how you're much nicer than these evil people on the other side, then most people out there in the country switch off. I mean, you might find it indulging as somebody who's a political activist, but most people out there in the country don't necessarily see themselves in these boxes of being on the left or being on the right. So when you get into that sort of stuff, I think a lot of people turn away from it. So I would happily debate and argue with Tories any day of the week about what should be the nature of the economy, how we should rebalance the economy in favour of the productive sector and away from finance capital, the importance of trade union rights, tackling regional inequalities, revitalising our industrial base, minimum wage, taxing the more well-off in society in order to help close that gap between rich and poor. I'd have those debates all day long, but if people say to me, you've got to call him an evil Tory when you're having that debate, I'm not interested in that. That bores me to tears, to be honest.
Obviously, you are not alone, Paul. Like, you're part of this Blue Labour movement, and I think we could bundle in thinkers and academics like David Goodhart, Matt Goodwin, Paul Collier into that quite large, interesting movement. Can you explain, again, especially to Americans, what Blue Labour is? You spoke about the founder, Morris Glassman. Can you explain what it is and your affiliation with it?
Yeah, someone once said, and I think it was a pretty pithy description, Blue Labour is socialism with a small c, which I think kind of describes it well, because on the one hand, it believes in reordering the economy. It doesn't believe in an economy that's in thrall to the market. It believes in the things I said before, decent wages and solid blue collar jobs and rebalancing the economy, tackling regional inequalities, boardroom excesses, and so on. But at the same time, it takes a very communitarian outlook, socially and culturally, and it kind of it's one of the organisations that fills that space that you talked about, that some of those other individuals, Matt Goodwin, David Goodhart, have been filling and articulating these particular ideas, which is to say that a very, very large number of people in this country, I think, are to the left economically. So they believe in, those things that I've outlined, but probably to the right on the cultural stuff, not to the degree that they're bigots or racists or reactionaries, but they believe very strongly in that sense of community, in family, in cultural tradition. They have that profound kind of sense of place and sense of belonging. And that often, I think, applies to working class communities where people's horizons are a bit narrower through no fault of their own. They haven't been to university, they don't have a lot of money, they can't afford to go and work abroad or, travel or go to work in other parts of the country. They don't have that professional background and the ability to do things that come with that. And as a result of that, their sense of place and community is often heightened, I think. And so that really is what Blue Labour is about. It's very much focusing on the importance of relationships and mutuality and reciprocity, and the idea that we are, social and parochial beings with an attachment to place, and believing on the one hand, as I said, that you need to challenge the domination of the market, but also believing you need to challenge the domination of an overbearing state, and that actually in between that is a space for humans and institutions to flourish by having that sense of reciprocity and mutuality. So that's really what Blue Labour is about.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that is worth emphasising is that Blue Labour and the writers that we've mentioned, including yourself, you have emphasised, especially in the wake of Brexit, the primacy, or just perhaps a readjustment in how we think about cultural issues versus economic issues, and that is probably thought of as the old style Marxist economic base of society determining relations. And people like Matt Goodwin came along, wrote his book, was it National Populism? And David Goodhart, the Road to Somewhere, and said, "Oh, hang on a second. Like as you mentioned previously in this interview, like 2 extra percentage points of GDP from remaining in the EU might not really matter that much compared to perhaps the more amorphous but very real ideas that came with the Leave vote, right? Like taking back control."
Exactly, and there's been, what some people call economism, an obsession with economic issues in terms of people believing that that's all that really matters, that everything in life is affected by people's place in the economic structure, and the very sort of determinist approach, and that's infected the left really, much to its detriment. I mean, I try to argue with people on the left for recent years have simply had the idea, I think, that all you need to do is throw more money at these communities and you would resolve all of their concerns, be it over immigration or whatever. And actually, I mean, that was proved wrong in 2017 when the Labour Party lost the election with arguably the most radical economic manifesto from a mainstream party in this country for many years. Similar situation in 2019, again, a radically economic manifesto, but got absolutely hammered. And I tried to say to people on the left, look, you're actually taking what is, in effect, a very sort of Thatcherite approach, which is to say it's all about the economy and nothing else. No such thing as society. You don't have to worry about people's concerns over immigration. You don't have to worry about very profound change taking place in their community. All you need to do is promise them a few extra quid in their pay packets at the end of the month, and they're going to be satisfied with it. And I'd long known that that wasn't the case. I mean, in going back to my experience living in Barking and Dagenham, the very idea that during that period where it was undergoing very significant change, that I could say to them, but don't worry, a Labour government will make you £20 a month or whatever better off, that they were going to go, oh, okay, well, that's absolutely fine. Everything is very rapidly changing about me. We're caught in this kind of storm of globalization. But if I'm 20 quid a month better off, then I'm willing to sacrifice it. It was always such a complete nonsense that people, it was obvious to me that people in those communities, and not just Barking and Dagenham, but large parts of post-industrial Britain, provincial Britain, small-town Britain, were going through a very similar phenomenon. These people simply weren't going to be bought off with promises of a few extra percentage points on GDP. And I think that's been proven. Whether the Labour Party will learn the lesson, who knows?
Yeah, Rory, did you want to ask Paul this hypothetical philosophical question for you on this point?
So this is a question which is trying to kind of get to the heart of what Blue Labour is and kind of where your position would be within that concept of Blue Labour. So the way that Western societies have been polarising in recent years has led to fringe debates and marginal political figures being elevated to the centre stage and dominating political debate, from the Eurosceptic right in the Conservative Party to the unforeseeable rise of Jeremy Corbyn and a brief return to radical politics in Labour. So with this in mind, if we looked forward to a hypothetical general election, say in 2029, from your perspective, which outcome would you rather see in these elections? The return of a victorious Conservative Party in the grip of the most rabid form of neoliberal free market capitalism, or a newly elected Labour government with a manifesto promising sweeping changes to a society motivated by a radical identitarian or woke agenda?
Well, I guess that's the proverbial difference between having pneumonia and influenza, isn't it? I mean, look, I always say, look, I'm an active member of the Labour movement. I had been for pretty much all of my adult life. I'm a member of the Labour Party, and I would always vote Labour and campaign for a Labour government over a Tory government. But the particular scenario that you present to me is not a particularly attractive one, I have to say. And to be honest, it's probably not beyond the realms of possibility. I mean, it could well be that we're faced with that scenario. I mean, I would hope very much that the Labour Party pulls back from that path, because that certainly is the path that it's on at the moment. And notwithstanding, despite what happened in 2019, large parts of it, I don't think they've still demonstrated any understanding of what truly has gone on, of why Labour got so badly hammered. I think large parts of the party are still in denial. They think it was only because the media were nasty about Jeremy Corbyn, or because the party was divided over Brexit, that we lost in 2019. Actually, the seeds of that defeat were, as I said, sown long before that particular election. So, I think that the way that I've presented it is, look, there are two groups inside the Labour Party at the moment vying for domination. You've got on the one hand the sort of liberal left, the Blairites, the so-called moderates and centrists, and on the other hand you've got the radical left and the Corbynistas, etc. But I think, as I said in a recent piece, it's almost like two bald men fighting over a comb, because they'll find that whoever gains control of the instrument will find that it's not fit for purpose, because they don't know what to do with it. So I would like to see Labour follow a radically different path before 2029, but I'm not terribly optimistic that it will.
And where does Blue Labour come into that? I mean, momentum kind of came into the Labour Party and totally transformed it in its own image under Corbyn. Do you think that there's any way that Blue Labour could do something similar, on a more, on a slightly different scale?
Well, I have said that to people. People, often say to me, "Well, why are you still in the Labour Party? It's pointless. It's a dead duck as far as traditional Labour-style politics are concerned, as far as being an electoral force again is concerned." But I do use that example. Actually, I say to people that no one could have predicted before 2015 exactly the radical change that Labour was suddenly going to go through. And throughout its history, actually, it's had that tendency to sort of to swing from left to right and back again. You had the Michael Foot leadership in 1983, the general election, the longest suicide note in history, as it was called, the manifesto, with a sort of very radical manifesto, and then the party sort of pulled itself back to what some people would call the centre. So I don't rule out the possibility that it could happen, and given what happened in 2019. It's certainly true that Blue Labour has a lot of political currency at the moment, because Blue Labour has been saying for some time that exactly what did happen was going to happen. So it kind of commands an audience in that respect. But I would be lying if I said that I think things are shifting significantly in that direction. I don't see it particularly. I think more people on the left are willing to listen in light of what happened in 2019. But I don't see any significant change anytime soon.
Sure. So back during the coalition, George Osborne used to say that when you're in government, you move the centre ground, and when you're in opposition, you move to the centre ground. And Boris Johnson has kind of moved to what some would call a Blue Labour position, kind of being left on the economy, right on social policy. I mean, that's something which you've kind of said is a little bit over exaggerated. But where's the room for a Blue Labour Party in opposition to a government which seems to have moved in that kind of direction?
It's a good question, because some people have argued, as you say, that Boris Johnson's government have parked their tanks on, if you like, old Labour territory, traditional Labour territory. And if you think of some of those constituencies in 2019 that fell to the Tories, Labour constituencies since time immemorial, places in post-industrial England that would once upon a time never have dreamed of voting Tory. And I think the difficulty is for Labour is, with that taboo having been broken, like any taboo, once it's broken, it's easier to do it again, having done it once. And if people in those communities feel that the Tories have tangibly improved their lives and their communities, then they probably will vote Tory again. I'm certainly sceptical about whether the Tories mean it or can deliver it. I think their messaging has been very clever. In the 2019 general election, "Get Brexit Done" was a hugely powerful slogan for those communities. Not forgetting that 2/3 of Labour constituencies actually voted Brexit. And that was certainly a part of why they decided to vote Tory in 2019, because of that promise to get Brexit done. Some of the messaging around levelling up has been pretty powerful, and they've articulated it, I think, in a better way than the Labour Party has done. But I just don't think they believe in it, actually. I think there are probably still large parts of the Tory party that don't really believe in that one nation Toryism, and are still very much part of the sort of Thatcher tradition, rolling back the frontiers of the state, handing things over to the market, letting privatisation reign supreme, etc. So those battles are going on in the Tory party. And actually, so far as they have talked about it, I think it's a lot of froth. I don't really think they've come up with any serious nuts and bolts around, what is the industrial strategy? How do we rebalance the economy away from finance capital and towards the productive sector? How do we revive our industrial base? How do we achieve full employment? How do we become more competitive? How do we increase productivity? You don't really hear the Tory party speaking about a lot of that stuff, which actually would go to the heart of a levelling up agenda in some of those post-industrial communities. So no, I'm sceptical about whether they can deliver it and whether they really mean it.
Paul, not to be sycophantic, but I'm going to be sycophantic. Rory and I were walking in the woods many months ago, and we said, can you imagine if Paul Embery was leader of the Labour Party? How many people would vote? I would certainly vote. Can we expect you to go into politics at any stage? Can we expect Paul Embery, Right Honourable MP, Paul Embery in 2029?
Probably not if it's the type of identitarian Labour Party that Rory was talking about a moment ago. I mean, first of all, I don't think they would have me. I mean that genuinely. I can't really imagine a constituency Labour Party. Bearing in mind, most constituency Labour parties are dominated either by one of those two tendencies, the liberal left or the radical left, and the sort of blue Labour voice is still very much a minority voice and actually looked upon with contempt by large parts of the party. I don't imagine there would be a constituency Labour Party that particularly would reach out to somebody like me and say, we would like you as a candidate for a general election. I mean, I don't ever rule that out, but I don't kind of sit here thinking that that's a plan or an objective of mine. I'm quite happy sort of doing what I'm doing from the outside, really, and I'm using whatever platform I've got to argue the things that I believe in and to try to influence things in any way I can. So who knows? But I don't imagine it's particularly likely.
What do you think would have to happen for a constituency to select you, for a committee to select you? Sorry.
I think that probably the Labour Party would need to have to undergo a very radical ideological overhaul. I think it would need to completely recalibrate its language and its priorities. It would need to stop dismissing large parts of the working class as bigoted and nativist and reactionary.
So is this a new leader?
I think it's much more than that. I mean, I've said it's the proverbial thing of whoever is the leader. It's a bit like shifting the deck chairs on the Titanic at the moment. Yeah. Until you change the very DNA of the party, the very nature of the party, and the party itself stop dismissing the kind of traditional working class, the old industrial working class, the Gillian Duffys of this world, as bigoted and reactionary and treating them, as I described it, as an embarrassing elderly relative. We want their votes at election time, but we don't really want to be seen in public with them. We don't really want them coming to our constituency Labour Party meetings. Until that mindset shifts in a dramatic way, then I can't imagine it happening.
Is that a Labour being crushed in 2024? Is that the only way? Kind of like the Marxist idea of if things just get really, really bad, then maybe. I mean, I've never agreed with that idea at a societal level, but at a party level, it kind of makes sense, right? You just have to look elsewhere. Would that cause people to do so?
I don't know really, because I think actually, particularly since 2015 and Corbyn became the leader, that there are probably significant parts of the party now who come, and lots of them came in after 2015, who come from that far left stroke hard left tradition, where it's almost just about having a purist ideology and not shifting from that, no compromise with the electorate. As long as we've argued the things that we believe are right, then if we win an election, then great, but if we don't, we're not going to change. It's a very kind of dogmatic way of looking at things. It's almost the thing that says that the electorate are filled with false consciousness, and it's the electorate that needs to abandon its false consciousness and follow us. We're not the ones in the wrong. It's such a patronising attitude, and actually it's a bankrupt attitude electorally, because this idea that the electorate really are a group of revolutionary socialists who are ready to man the barricades the moment they drop their false consciousness, and that they're just sort of filled with these false ideas as a result of the muck of ages, or what the media are telling them. Yeah. It's just complete and utter nonsense. But there are large parts of the party, I think, who would be more content to lose an election if it meant that they didn't have to compromise their own purist ideology. And that's dangerous in a mainstream political party. Having so many people in a party with that mindset is dangerous, because it's those people who will take you to electoral irrelevance at the end of the day.
Is there any element of the false consciousness doctrine that you would subscribe to? I mean, obviously people can be fooled, when you ask them specific questions about how many immigrants are in the country or how much do we spend on welfare, people often give you an order of magnitude answer, different from reality. I agree it's patronising, but I remember Jonathan Rose, who I spoke to previously, who spoke about your wonderful book. He said, look, it's not that the idea is entirely wrong. It's just, as you say, it's electorally terrible. And you can't speak to people in such a patronising fashion if you expect to win them over.
Yeah, and of course, there are times when people are wrong on stuff. I've never believed in the sort of the attitude of the customer is always right. I mean, people are sometimes wrong on stuff, and you have to debate with people where you think they're wrong. But I think in terms of the sort of Marxist approach to it, it's the false consciousness thing. Effectively means that they really would be supporting our entire ideology, not just from this argument to that argument, but they really would be supporting our ideology if it wasn't for the fact that they had this false consciousness.
The veil of capitalism, class consciousness,
They would see capitalism for what it is, that it doesn't work in their interests, and they would join with us, the revolutionary socialists at the barricades. They would really want to do that if they didn't have this problem with false consciousness, and I just think that's fundamentally wrong. And if you believe that, then frankly you're never gonna win people over. I mean, I remember being friends with people in the Socialist Workers' Party, for example, some years ago. I still am friends with some of them, and they were very passionate about what they believed in, but spoke to what you would call ordinary working class people in a way that just left people believing and knowing that there was just a massive disconnect there. That it was almost like if you see people walking down the high street and there's a religious preacher there who is reciting chapter and verse through a megaphone, and he's wearing the sandwich boards. People have just got this natural tendency to look at that person and think they're probably a little bit bonkers, they're sort of lecturing me in this weird way. Whereas if you have a very subtle conversation with a religious person in a way that their language is very temperate and accessible, then it can have much more of an impact. But people on that radical left, I think, just lecture people, and because they live in their own little world so much and often only mix with people from their own group, as I say, they just think that everybody thinks like they do, and when they try to deliver that stuff to ordinary people out there on the street, it just doesn't resonate at all, because there's just too much of a disconnect there. You have to speak to people in language they understand and in a way that they understand. I'm not saying that means you abandon your principles, but it's the only way you're ever going to win popular support if you want to be a serious party of government.
What's the most woke idea that you agree with?
Oh God, that's interesting. I'm not sure I agree with too many woke ideas. I did think I heard a suggestion, whether you call this woke, I guess some people would call it woke. I heard someone suggest that when it came to job interviews, that people shouldn't be required to put their actual names on application forms, because there was, and I think this is probably true, there was evidence to suggest that if you had an Anglo-Saxon name, you were more likely to make it to interview stage than if you had a Muslim name, for example. And I think there's an argument to say that if it's proven that structurally in that way people are being rejected simply because their name was wrong, then actually saying that people shouldn't be required to put their names at those early stages of an interview is probably a legitimate one. So I've got sympathy with that idea, which, as I say, I guess some people would call woke, and maybe one or two others.
That's just empirical, though, surely. I feel like that's like if that's what the science says, the social science says, then that's obviously what we have to do as a government. We can't allow people to be structurally discriminated against. I was thinking personally for you, it's more like something like, not, again, you don't subscribe to it chapter and verse, but like lived experience is a horrible, horrible phrase. But I think the best part of your book, by far, was when you were talking about Dagenham and what it used to be. And just like again, we don't want to put the primacy on lived experience, like so we can never talk to anybody. But actually, I do think it's really important to speak to different people and find out about their backstory and where they came from. I think that's part of humanizing them. It's just when we put everything on that, right?
Yeah, no, I think that's fair. I think my problem with when people often invoke the lived experience argument, they often use it as a way of saying to the other person, so that invalidates your view instantly.
Yeah.
The fact that you don't have my lived experience means not only is your view invalid, but actually you shouldn't be commenting at all. And we saw a lot of that, I think, around the Black Lives Matter movement and the ensuing debate, where anybody who was white and tried to intervene in that debate, even in a subtle way, and would express criticism of the movement or particular tactics, was told, well, you don't know what racism is, you're not a black person, you don't have my lived experience, and consequently, you have no space in this debate at all. That would be my objection. There's a lot of that about, and that would be my objection to it. But in terms of people's personal experience, then of course, if people have got particular personal experiences, whether it's they come from a particular socio-economic background, or they're from a minority ethnic group and they've experienced first-hand racism, of course they have a particular insight which people should listen to. I accept that completely.
In the chapter in your book, Paul, titled The New National Religion, Liberal Wokedom, you cite a number of examples, including that of a retired police officer, Harry Miller, who was investigated by Humberside Police for retweeting a limerick that opposed the notion of gender self-declaration, also known as self-ID. In response to this, Mr. Miller was contacted by a community cohesion officer who informed him that he had committed no crime, but we need to check your thinking, with the retweet of the limerick being eventually recorded by the police as a hate incident. When you see these kind of everyday examples that a few years ago might have seemed ripe for a satirical story in The Onion, do you think that we're moving from a society based on the rule of law to a more brazenly ideological set of ever-changing rules that seem to be drifting in a dystopian direction?
I think we probably are moving in that direction. I think that there is an authoritarianism existing now in political debate that is far worse than anything we've seen for a number of years, I think. And I think there are people in positions of authority, and the police are a good example, who are petrified of saying no, who see a particular vocal minority that have a very strong view on a particular issue or a set of issues, and think instantly, well, these people are a minority, whether the gender one is, as you just touched on, the gender one is an obvious example, and trans rights, etc. And we can't afford to say no to these people, because if we do, we're going to be hammered as bigots, and we're not prepared to put ourselves through that. And the danger is there, I think, that any minority cause, even if it's a cause without particular merit, is just allowed to get its way and to become established simply through fear of people in positions of authority of saying no. And actually, there have been times when causes which began as a minority were actually creditable causes and very worthy causes, and we should pay tribute to those minorities who fought for racial equality, equality in terms of the sexes and so on, LGBT rights, etc. But that doesn't mean that every time a minority comes along and demands similar, that we have to say yes. Sometimes I think you have to say no. And because people are fearful in authority of saying no, it means that we're allowing some madcap ideas to come in. I mean, the gender pronouns one, when it first started coming out, that some organizations, companies, institutions may start asking people to announce their pronouns when they're sending emails or when they're speaking at meetings, etc. I remember most people said, well, yeah, that can't happen. That would just be one step too far. It would be absolutely crazy. Surely we don't want to go there. And I remember saying to people, just watch in a few months' time. What is at the moment a crazy sounding idea will gradually seep in, because institutions and officials will be scared of, in the end, saying no. And sure enough, we've seen stories recently. Marks and Spencer, the Ministry of Defence are now starting to talk about workers being required, or at first advising them, but we know what that really means. You know, you're going to be expected to do it. And I've started receiving emails from people working for public institutions where every worker has now got their gender pronouns at the bottom of it. And that I think is what's happening. And you know, the sad thing is that there have been, as I said, genuine worthy causes that began as minority causes, and it was absolutely right that those objectives of those causes were delivered in the end. But that, I think, has led to a mindset now amongst influential people at the top that says any such cause, any minority cause that comes along in the future, you know, we're gonna have to indulge it, and that can actually lead us to, when you think about the logic of it, that can lead us to some very worrying places. I mean, one of the dangers, I think, is pretty much every public institution now, and lots of private commercial institutions, will have diversity and inclusion officers who are quite well paid, whose sole job, apparently, and I've seen some of these people at work actually, whose sole job is to take things to the next level in terms of diversity and inclusion. And there becomes this sort of ratchet effect, because that's their job, and because they're well paid for it. If they're sitting doing nothing and not taking things to the next level, and not thinking, well, what's the next thing we have to do? You know, we've got the gender pronouns things in. We can't stop there, otherwise I might be out of a job. What's the next thing I could do? So they come up with the next kind of radical idea. And the problem is they then present that to the board. And because the board is petrified of rejecting it and saying, no, we're not going with that one, they go, okay, yeah, we'll do that next. And it has a very worrying ratchet effect, which has led us to the place where we are now. And, you know, frankly, God knows where we're going to be in 3 or 4 years' time with some of this stuff. That's my theory anyway.
It's like the last illogical step justifies the next illogical step.
Exactly.
The more radical you become, the more radical you need to become to outdo the last radical move. So. The
whole thing becomes self-perpetuating, I think, in truth, yeah.
On this idea of that, where is this going to end? Obviously, a lot of people will look at pronouns and think, well, it's just being kind. You know, it's just compassion. And I've got a lot of truck with that argument. You know, I would never refuse to use someone's pronouns if they asked me. And often this debate, you know, you go back to like Jordan Peterson, the video that made him famous, and a lot of the silly things that he said. People will, I would say straw man, but it's not, I don't think it's that far off to say something like, well, he's kind of making an argument where implicitly it's like, well, pronouns leads to the gulags. Okay, maybe that's absurd, but you've tweeted some things recently, like finance, I think it's banks or certain financial companies needing permission to hire white men. We're seeing with, you know, the George Floyd trial and now Rittenhouse that it's politicized to such an extent in the US that even the right to a free trial, you know, guilty, innocent until proven guilty, might be at risk. So I think there are tangible things that we can talk about as being at risk, one because of social media and two because of you know, radical ideology. Is that how you see it?
Yeah, I mean, and you know, the first part of your question is you know, it may be extreme to say that this stuff leads to the gulags, but it does lead us to a place, I think, which is a very illiberal one, and a society that demands rigid conformity, and where people don't conform doesn't say to them, I disagree with you and here's why, but says you actually now need to be punished or sanctioned in some way. And if you are somebody with any sort of public profile, you know, if you're a celebrity of some kind, or if you're a manager in the public services or a politician, if you step across the line, and we've seen it, you know, the demands that people have their livelihood and their reputation trashed, and it's happened. You know, people have had their careers destroyed. So I do think that's worrying, and I do think, as I say in the book, I do think there is a very real threat to the presumption of innocence in a way that we haven't really seen in this country before. I mean, I happen to believe that the presumption of innocence is one of the most important foundation stones of a civilized society, because it's that which separates civilized societies from tyrannies at the end of the day. If you're accused of something, then actually you're regarded as innocent until somebody proves otherwise. And it's almost now like to be accused at all is to be tainted and to have your career destroyed. And, there's lots of examples, I guess, we could pull out where we've seen that. And I just sometimes think that the people who push this stuff have got probably no idea of where their ideas do lead, and don't understand why it's so important to have a principle like the presumption of innocence, don't understand why it's important to defend free speech, not just for those you agree with, but for those particularly who you disagree with. Not least, actually, because it's often the best way to achieve progress. I mean, progress is generally made as a result of people going against the orthodoxy, whether it's the scientific orthodoxy or the political orthodoxy or whatever, and people saying, actually, I think this is the right way to go. I think your ideas are wrong and these are better. We should welcome that. I'm not saying we agree with people. I believe in passionate debate, and if people are wrong, you tell them so. But you absolutely defend the right of people to put their point of view. So all of that stuff, I do think is under threat, without kind of engaging in hyperbole in a way that we probably haven't seen for a long time in this country. And I think it's really worrying.
The last question that we have for you is, again, in a similar vein, because trade unions, one would have thought, are set up to represent the worker and the worker's best interests. And you've had your run-in with trade unions. We've just seen that Kathleen Stock has basically been forced out. I mean, people say, oh, she wasn't cancelled, she left, she's got a good job at this new university. I mean, it's kind of beside the point. Like the environment was made so inhospitable that she felt that she had to leave. Her trade union came out backing her, but also saying there's institutional transphobia at the University of Sussex, which could only mean her, given the context of what was going on there. How did trade unions, of all institutions, capitulate to, you can call it woke pressure, woke ideology, or just this kind of radical spirit?
Well, I think there's a number of reasons, and I think some of them are historical. I think, first of all, if you look at the deunionisation that's taken place in the country, particularly since around 1980, where the number of trade union members have halved over the last 40 years. I think it was about 13 million in 1980, and it's now about 6.5 million today. First of all, that, but equally, I think that the fact that the unions now are not represented in any serious way across large parts of the private sector in the way that they used to be, particularly when we had a big manufacturing base, and lots of our factories and plants were heavily unionised. I mean, now to a certain degree, that's not the union's fault, because deindustrialisation has taken place, and those workplaces don't exist in such large degree anymore. But we do have the gig economy. We do have call centres where people are often exploited and working long hours and need a trade union to defend them. And it seems to me the trade unions have not really had any strategy for replacing members with those who were previously in what you might call heavy industry, with those who are in new forms of working in the private sector. I think that means that trade unions have largely kind of retreated to their public sector comfort zone. Proportionately now, they're far more represented in the private sector, the public sector compared to the private sector when compared to years gone by. And I think that has meant that the trade union movement has too often seen things politically from within the prism, through the prism of the public sector, and not necessarily those working in private industry, and has largely become a voice of the London liberal class, actually, rather than a voice of provincial and post-industrial Britain. And has, as you say, very much kind of swallowed that hyper-liberal and woke agenda. I think partly as well because the labour movement now has itself gone through a transition. The labour movement now is very much more middle class, and is a voice for the professional and managerial classes, a voice for student radicals and social activists and Twitter and graduates and people living in our fashionable cities and stuff. And that has meant that when you look at the representatives of the Labour movement in Parliament, for example, far fewer MPs in the Labour Party now come from a genuine working class background compared to years gone by. Many of them come through on that conveyor belt of middle class background, university, work for a few years at a think tank or a charity or as a research assistant, then get a seat in Parliament. That's the case in some cases for senior people within the trade union movement, where they sort of come through that conveyor belt, university, then work as a researcher, a policy officer, and then get a place at the head of the TUC or whatever. And I think all of those reasons combined have led to a situation where, as you say, the trade union movement too often doesn't represent the voice of old industrial Britain, of working class and provincial Britain. I'm a passionate trade unionist. I think they are so important in the workplace in terms of delivering better pay and better conditions, etc. And are historically the reason why people have had better pay and conditions in the workplace. But there's no doubt that large parts of the movement are completely out of step, I think, with working class Britain. And that is a real problem for the whole movement.
So we're going to end with 4 quick-fire questions. And Rory, you've got the first.
These have always got the capacity to go terribly wrong.
Oh, yes.
These quick-fire questions.
Well, I've heard before that your favourite fiction book is The Ragged Trousered Philanthropists. Is this still your favourite fiction book, and what is your favourite non-fiction book?
It's Ragged Trousered Philanthropists is certainly one of my favourite fiction books. I would say that my favourite book of all time fiction is a bit of an obscure one, but quite an epic. It's called Independent People, and it's written by an Icelandic Nobel Prize winning author called Halldór Laxness, and it's set in the early years of the 20th century in the bleak Icelandic landscape and revolves around a sheep farmer and his family. Now, if that doesn't appeal to you, then then I don't know what would. But no, seriously, it's an epic novel written in the 1930s, and I would recommend it. Non-fiction, I'm not sure I've ever been asked that question, to be honest. I mean, I do read quite a lot of biographies and autobiographies, etc. Actually, I'd probably say, you mentioned Orwell earlier. I'd probably say The Road to Wigan Pier as non-fiction. I enjoyed that immensely, and I think that was a very powerful book about the poverty in Britain in the 1930s and so on. So yeah, that was compelling.
Good choice.
What would you have chosen as an occupation, with the knowledge that you have now, going through several different occupations, and I would say also at this time, with AI and technological advancements?
Ooh, good. I mean, always as a kid wanted to be a professional footballer, and when obviously I was speaking to Rory off camera about playing for the Millwall Academy when I was a kid for quite a few years. So that was my dream, really, but that wasn't realised. I mean, I'm a firefighter, and I can't say I don't enjoy doing that. I mean, I enjoyed my career immensely in the fire service, and probably wouldn't change that.
Something else in the services, police, maybe?
Possibly. I mean, funnily enough, I was having a conversation with my son the other day, who's nearly 15, so he's kind of thinking about a future career. And I did say to him that if I had my time again, I would probably join the Royal Navy.
Oh, nice.
I think that kind of seems a rewarding way of life. So that, but I've always enjoyed writing, as I said earlier in the interview. So possibly a full-time journalist, dedicated to that full-time as well. So one of those things, I imagine, yeah.
Is that Royal Marines? Was there any particular interest?
I don't know about Royal Marines. That'd be pretty tough. Although I do sort of work out quite a bit. I like to look after my fitness. not necessarily Marines, but I think just sailing the seven seas really with the Royal
Nice.
Navy. Not that I'm making it sound easy, but yeah, it would appeal to me. I think being in the Royal Navy.
And Paul, what advice would you give to young people that are kind of setting out on their careers, be that, you know, political activists, journalists? What advice would you give them going into this world that looks, you know, it's very polarized, very confrontational? What would you say to them?
A couple of things, if they'd listen. A couple of things, I think. I mean, Tony Benn, as I said, one of my political heroes, always said you should never wrestle with a chimney sweep. And what he meant by that, obviously, is that, you know, if someone's fighting dirty or engaging in abuse, then don't descend to that level, because you end up getting dirty yourself. And, you know, always try and keep the moral high ground. Now, yeah, I don't say I always manage to do that, but I do try to go beyond the abuse and just, you know, concentrate on the issues and try to have the political debate. And I would advise anybody else to do that, because I think it stands you in good stead in the long term. And actually the public prefer people who just stick to arguing the issues passionately rather than just slinging abuse at each other. And just stick to your guns, really. You know, you'll get brickbats for it, but again, in the long term. And you should always, I think, look at the long term when it comes to politics and not be obsessed with the 24-hour news cycle. Stick to that, because I think you'll gain respect for it in the end. Even if people disagree with you, you know, people will say, well, actually, he or she argues for what they believe in, and even if I don't agree with it, you know, they take the flak, but they'll stick to their guns. And I think that probably pays dividends in the long term. So probably that as well.
Final question: if you could change one policy, what would it be?
Change one policy. So if I could sort of introduce one policy, I think I would renationalise the railways. I think the privatisation of the railways, I think, has been a disaster. I think it's led to an overpriced and fragmented and dirty service. British Rail was certainly no ideal model, but if you look at the way we kind of subsidise the private contractors now, and what we've actually got for it, I would, if I was Prime Minister, that would probably be the first thing I would try and get through Parliament, taking the railways back into public ownership. Well,
hopefully, Paul, in 2029, you will be elected. And we can look forward to that.
Well, yeah, I mean, you never know, but I can't say I'm terribly optimistic.
Thank you so much for chatting with us.
My pleasure.
Thank you for watching or listening to that conversation with Paul Embery. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. If you want to support this channel, this one-man operation, then you can do so by becoming a patron over on Patreon for just $1 or £1 per month. It really helps me. You get early access to the videos as well, and your name in the credits. On the higher tiers, you can get access to some extra goodies like Zoom calls with myself, and there's also a new book club tier that I've just launched. That's limited to 5 people at the moment. One person's already joined, so it's actually limited to 6. But we'll be meeting once a month to talk about books like Paul's. And yeah, if you join that tier, you can gain access to a monthly conversation with me and like-minded people. So if you would like to support the show, please check out that link down below. But as always, I will see you in the next one.
1, 2, 1, 2, 3.